What we did find out is that that income tax cut for some was being paid for by an income tax rise for some of the poorest taxpayers in the country. Gordon Brown had scrapped the lowest level of income tax, the 10p band. And he, like another Labour Chancellor, Dennis Healey, all those years ago, was greeted with howls of outrage. The problem this time is they were coming from his own supporters.
I'm afraid the real problem for us was there was an awful lot of people who bluntly were traditional Labour voters and certainly been with us in support for the last 10 years, who suddenly found their income had dropped. And they're the ones who said, hold on, what have you done to us?
When Alistair Darling took over from Brown at the Treasury, he also took over the daunting problem of compensating those who'd paid the price for a good headline.
At a cost of £2.7 billion, I will increase the individual personal tax allowances by £600 to £6,000.
The eventual bill was closer to £6 billion, and it was politically costly too. Just 8 days after Darling's attempted salvage job, Labour lost a once-safe seat in a by-election in Crewe and Nantwich.
20,539.
This was not well managed at all. This was a political disaster, and it took a heavy toll.
The reality is that the biggest money spinner of all, income tax, has now become a dead cert political loser. The political consensus that it was impossible to raise income tax meant that government simply couldn't raise enough money that way. There was, of course, a simple solution. Tax people's incomes, but do it with a tax called something different. National insurance. The government takes not only income tax from our pay packets, but also national insurance, which of course is paid by employers too. Is wise venture a wise venture? It's hard to keep track of how much we cough up, let alone where it goes. Thanks very much indeed. So, with some punters, I did a few sums. How much income tax do you think you pay?
2,000? 3,000? Oh my God!
How much do you think you pay in national insurance?
2,500?
2,500?
Wow. I need a pay rise.
Would you like to pay more tax, Kirsty?
No, I wouldn't actually.
You wouldn't?
No.
But if you had to have a tax rise, which would you rather it was income tax or national insurance?
I would prefer that it was national insurance.
Because?
Because I believe in the national health system, and I think it's far better to pay into that.
I think if they had to put one up, I'd prefer it to be national insurance.
Because?
Because I think that goes towards healthcare and things that I will need in the future.
So if they're going to put anything up, put up the national insurance. If I told you they're absolutely the same, income tax and national insurance, they pay for exactly the same things.
No, that's just like wrong.
They do. Many of us may think that national insurance is not just another tax, but some kind of, well, insurance, paying exclusively for health and pensions. That was true once, now it's a fiction. Yet it's one which serves politicians well to maintain.
At the top, Mr. Brown, please.
In the budget of 2002, Gordon Brown, the Chancellor who'd pledged not to raise income tax, raised the tax on our incomes by putting up national insurance. The clever bit was the way he sold it to us.
We as a nation will have to spend more on health care. I believe it is right that when everyone, employees and employers, benefit from the insurance provided by the National Health Service, everyone who can should make a fair contribution.
Market researcher Deborah Mattinson had tested every key phrase in focus groups. Her job was to find a way to sell Gordon Brown's tax rise.
First off, it was about ring-fencing the money and saying this will go on the NHS, and that the NHS needed more investment, which people bought relatively easily, and it resulted in a tax rise that 8 out of 10 people supported and were in favour of, which I think is quite an achievement.
So finally someone had done it, come up with a popular tax rise. How did Gordon Brown do it? Well, first and foremost, by not calling it an income tax rise. Second, by making it seem to be for a very specific purpose. And thirdly, by linking it with the national religion, the NHS. But there's a sting in this tale. If the government thought it would get the credit for the spending produced by that tax rise, it was to be mistaken.
What we found, very frustratingly, was what we began to describe as I've been lucky syndrome. So people would say, you know, my local primary school is okay, but I've been lucky. Or I took my daughter to the A&E, we were seen in half an hour, but we were lucky. So in other words, when they started to see that change in their own lives, they didn't assume that this was happening all over the country.
And does that have an impact of undermining the ability of politicians to ask for more money to spend?
It completely undermined the ability, because basically people didn't feel that things had improved. What had happened to them, their experience, what they'd seen, was an isolated lucky fluke. I've been lucky.
And this could be one of the biggest problems of all for politicians trying to raise more tax on our incomes. Whatever the evidence, we never seem to think we're getting a bargain. How much do we get back in return for the taxes that we give to the government? Well, that depends, of course, on where we are on the income scale. Let's put all the households in the UK into 10 equal groups, starting with the poorest and moving up to the richest. This shows what households on average get from government. The higher the bar, the more the group gets in things like healthcare, education, pensions and benefits, pretty much everything the government spends its money on. As we go down the income scale towards the poorest, we see that on average poorer households get slightly more from the government. No surprise there, because of course they get more in terms of benefits. But now let's add something. Let's see what happens when you add in how much people pay in tax. Above the line is what you're getting from the government. Below the line is what you're paying to them in taxes. For the first 6 groups, that's for 60% of all households. On average, they are getting more back than they're paying in. But then look at the top 40% of households. On average, they are getting less than they pay. And this last one, the top, the richest 10%, they contribute on average about 5 times in tax more than they are getting back. There is a further twist, though, which makes life even harder for politicians. Opinion polls show that even people in those groups that do receive the most don't see it that way. They tell pollsters they simply don't believe that they're getting more back than they've paid in. If taxing people's incomes is hard to sell, what about taxing the things we buy instead? Leicester is home to one of the biggest markets in Europe. Plenty here, you might think, for a chancellor to take a bite of. If only it were that simple. There is a tax that we all pay almost every day and yet often barely notice it. It's a tax that generates a vast amount of revenue and can generate a vast amount of political controversy. It operates in a pretty bizarre way, and yet any politician who tries to sort that out ends up with a bloody nose. It's nearly 40 years since the Chancellor of the Exchequer introduced VAT, value-added tax. You paid 10% on everything, except the essentials, food and children's clothes. He called it a simple tax. How times change. Take pet food. I'll take those if I may, please.
Oh, yes, sir.
Now, has that got VAT with it?
Yes, it has.
What, you paid VAT on these?
Yeah.
Really?
Terrible, isn't it? Now, if it was a bag of rabbit food, then there's no VAT on it because we eat rabbits, but our dogs are pets, so you're charged.
So there's no VAT on rabbit food, but there is on dog food.
Yeah. If you buy some biscuits in the supermarket for you, then there's no VAT on it. But dog biscuits you charge VAT on.
So if I gave my dog chocolate chip cookies,
yeah, no VAT.
No VAT. But if I give my dog these, what hasn't got VAT? What can I feed my dog that hasn't got VAT?
Rabbit food, sorry.
Right, where is it?
There's no VAT on
What
that.
do you think the dog would eat that?
There's no VAT on wild birds.
No VAT on those, right?
But
Okay.
if you have the cockatiel seed,
Yes.
because it's got some seed in and some of them, then that's vatable because it's for a specific animal.
Are you a tax accountant?
No, I have to split it all for me accounts of extra
Does it make any
hardware.
sense?
No.
Clearly time for me to do some homework. The once simple rules on what is and is not vatable now run to almost 3,500 pages. Even the stall holders seem confused. What about tea?
Yes, I think, yeah.
No, you don't pay VAT on that. But if I go and buy a cup of tea over there, I do pay VAT on that. Jaffa cakes. VAT? No VAT.
No.
Now what about popcorn? VAT or not VAT? And the right answer is no.
I said that in the first place.
That one doesn't pay. That one does pay VAT. Why? Don't ask me, I'm not the Chancellor.
It's as clear as mud, isn't it? It really, really is.
With all this confusion and complexity, it might seem straightforward, sensible even, for politicians to simplify things and add VAT to more goods, raising a few quid as they do. Well, not quite. Takeaways used to be tax-free until back in 1984 the then Tory government decided to extend VAT to cover them. Logical, painless, or so they thought.
Restaurant meals were subject to VAT, but takeaway food was not subject to VAT. If you sat down and had a meal, you were paying VAT. If you took the thing away as a takeaway, you weren't. So I thought that's ridiculous. So I said, well, we'll put VAT on takeaway meals as well.
But some political heavyweights found that hard to swallow.
It's diabolical. This is a tax on the customer. It's a tax on the consumer. It's 15% on the price of food for a lot of pensioners, a lot of students, a lot of school children, a lot of unemployed, and a lot of people with large families who go out to work and rely on hot takeaways such as fish and chips and so on.
As well as that battering, there was a problem with the men at the revenue.
Well, then the Customs and Excise said to me, well, look, this is very difficult to draw a line because some takeaway foods, for example, a salad, is very much like going to the grocers and getting it there, and you don't have to pay VAT there. And how do we draw the line between groceries and takeaway food? So I came to the absurd conclusion, but it has stuck ever since, and it is the law, that I would say if it was hot, you paid VAT, and if it's cold, you don't.
For 30 years, it has been Tory chancellors who've extended VAT and hiked the rate, whilst Labour politicians have condemned them for taxing the poor. But under Gordon Brown, a battle raged, not between the parties, but within his government. He was desperate not to put VAT up, but his Chancellor living next door was desperate to do just that. Desperate because boom had turned to bust. The City of London and the housing market, which had provided so much of the cash which the Treasury had depended on, had crashed. The man responsible for balancing the books had already raised the top rate of income tax. Now he wanted to do precisely what his party had spent decades attacking the Tories for doing.
What I wanted to do was to gradually increase VAT up to 19 or 20%. That would have allowed me to have cut personal taxes, taken more people out of tax, and critically, not only could I have compensated the people on fixed incomes who otherwise would lose out with that, I could also make a sizable inroad into cutting our borrowing.
Nick Pearce worked at the time as a senior aide to Gordon Brown. He recalls how the Prime Minister and his team thought a VAT rise would be seen as penalising the poor, and a massive political U-turn.
People in number 10 thought, look, that's not a fair tax, it's a regressive tax, it will split the Labour Party potentially, and it blunts the sort of sense that Labour has responded to the crisis with fairness. because it's quite hard to argue that VAT is a fair tax.
Alistair Darling was told that a VAT rise would hand the election to the Tories. He was ordered to increase national insurance